Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today, we'll be talking about Pre-Columbian America, or the history of the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. Because, of course, long before Europeans explored the Americas, the Western Hemisphere was settled by prehistoric peoples, which does bring up the question, what is history? And to some people, this simply is whatever happened in the past. Some people attach numerous concepts to it. For some, a great admiration for history, their heritage, what gives them their identity. For other people, it is a list of things that have caused problems in the past that need to be overcome. And I think there can be some truth in both of those, but neither of those are very technical descriptions. From a technical point of view, when we speak of history, we typically mean things for which there is a written record. And for that reason, because as far as we know, almost none of the American Indians living in North America before the arrival of Europeans had a written language. And the very few who had writing that we know of, we have only very limited samples of. Means we really have to regard almost all of this as prehistoric. And so almost everything we know about these peoples comes not from history, but from archaeology. Still, a lot of archaeology has been done. And most scientists believe that the first people to come to the Americas were the ancestors of the American Indians, and they came across the Bering Strait about 10,000 BC, because during the last ice age, around that time, seawater was lower. So much water was frozen in the polar ice caps and in glaciers that sea level lowered, and a land bridge was created connecting Asia and North America, and people just wandered across hunting the woolly mammoth and other large prehistoric creatures that I'm sure are delicious. There is some evidence that suggests, however, that people came before that, quite likely during the previous ice age, around 35,000 BC. Although a few scientists, a growing number of scientists, claim to have found evidence of human settlement in at least some parts of the Americas as long ago as 50,000 years BC, and possibly earlier than that, at least on the west coast. Although if so, we don't really know how they got there, because there wasn't an ice age around that time. Some have proposed that there was a connection between the Americas, or at least Western South America, and the islands of Polynesia in the South Pacific. Either that Polynesians settled Western South America, or possibly that people from Western South America visited Polynesia. And experiments such as the famous Kon-Tiki voyage in the mid-20th century demonstrated that it was possible for people to sail from South America to the islands of Polynesia with the kind of technology they probably had at the time, although the fact that it could be done does not mean that it was. But before modern science suggested these theories, people had all kinds of other ideas. For example, there was a widespread belief at one point that the Indians were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, or possibly settlers from Europe who came to America sometime in a distant past. The Welsh, for example, claimed that Prince Madoc colonized Alabama. In the late 1800s, it was claimed that the Melungeon people of Upper East Tennessee were descended from the Carthaginians, which was very important because under the Jim Crow laws at the time, it was much better to be a Carthaginian than it was to be classified as black. Still, the people who would settle in America are typically known as Indians, which of course is inaccurate because they're not from India. But that is what some of the earliest Europeans who encounter them believed them to be. This, of course, is a contentious term today, since they're not from India, and many prefer to call them Native Americans, but in fact, the majority, although certainly not all, of Indians prefer the term Indian, particularly American Indian. and that is a term we'll try to use in this course. Although what most would truly prefer would be thought of not as Indians at all, but as separate nations. So just as we not speak often of Europeans, but of English or French or Germans, Indians would think of themselves naturally as hundreds of different nations and prefer to be referred to as, say, Cherokee or Shawnee or Navajo. Although in fact, the names often used for different Indian nations are not the names they use for themselves. Those we have long called the Navajo preferred to be called the Diné. While we don't have much written history, we do have a lot of archaeology for Indian civilization. An important part of civilization, of course, is food. And corn was first grown in what is now northern Mexico. And from there spread across North America and down into South America, reaching what's now the eastern seaboard of the United States around AD 1000. Later, the cultivation of corn was combined with the farming of beans and squash, and these three crops, which were often grown together, were known as the Three Sisters in many Indian cultures. And rather than planting them in rows, the seeds for the corn, beans, and squash were planted in mounds. The corn stalk grew up, the beans climbed the corn stalk, the squash spread out from there, which is efficient, and for reasons perhaps your biology teacher can tell you, the combination of those different plants allowed some of the plants, particularly the beans, to replenish nutrients taken out of the soil by the other plants. Of course, many other crops were known in America that were not known in the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, such as tomatoes, potatoes, chocolate, and tobacco. But these were important in the lives of various Indian groups. Now, in most of what is now the United States, there were not large empires or centralized kingdoms, or even big cities, like those we think of in Central America or the Andes of South America, although there were a few exceptions. And even if there were not large unified empires, there were some cultural groups, we might call them, where people shared a similar culture, at least to the extent that we can tell that from the artifacts that they left behind and the trade routes that their roads suggest must have been there. In the southwestern U.S., around the Colorado River, agriculture based on corn allowed a pretty large and cohesive culture to develop, a culture the Spanish referred to as the Pueblo, coming from a Spanish word for village, because, like many Indian nations, the Pueblo are typically known to us by a name other people gave them. The Spanish called them this because when the Spanish first encountered them in the 1500s, they lived in large villages made up of houses and even large apartments built of mud bricks called adobe. And some of these houses were apartments of multiple stories, which was pretty impressive to the Spanish at the time. But in the past, the ancestors of the Pueblo had created even more impressive dwellings, carved deep in the ground or in cliff faces. Some of these historical Pueblo people we call the Anasazi. Although this was not what they called themselves, the Navajo called them this, and that meant ancient enemy. But they built, in some cases, entire towns on the sides of cliffs. The most famous of these cliff dwellings, as we call them, was at Mesa Verde, in what's now southwestern Colorado. There was also a massive settlement at Chaco Canyon, in what is now New Mexico. And the towns of the Anasazi were linked by extensive road networks, which really indicates a very closely linked culture. Chaco Canyon was a center of these road networks and is believed to have been a major religious center or possibly a major trading center, such as a marketplace for the entire cultural group, or perhaps both of those, although probably not the capital, again, of a unified empire. But Chaco Canyon's dominance of the region came to an end sometime between 1150 and 1450 AD, apparently due to drought, which struck many parts of the world in that period, although possibly due to warfare between different Pueblo groups, or maybe between the Pueblos and outsiders, or maybe some combination of those. Still, in some aspects of their culture survived, and again, their construction skills were used to build large adobe towns that impressed the Spanish so much as they explored the Southwest. Now, in the Mississippi River Valley and its tributaries, another culture developed between around 800 and 1500 AD. A culture that, because it is found around the Mississippi River, we call the Mississippian culture, is also referred to as a culture of the Mound-Builders, because they often built very impressive mounds. Some burial mounds, some of them the foundations of towns or even cities. Some very large cities had multiple mounds, a large mound with smaller mounds on top of it. Some mounds, such as Ohio's Serpent Mound, are built in the shape of animals, typically snakes, often on such a large scale that it would be difficult to even really envision what the mound would look like without a view from above, which has led some to speculate that the mound builders were guided in building these by aliens who could plot them out with their flying saucers. But that's not really a theory I wish to strongly advance or encourage you to put on an essay. The economy of the Mississippians was based again on agriculture and on hunting, also on trade along the waterways of the Mississippi watershed. Indeed, goods from around the Great Lakes have been found near the Gulf Coast, and vice versa. So there's clearly very widespread trade throughout this region. And they're also known for the mounds that they built, although unfortunately many of these were dug up and destroyed in the late 1800s and early 1900s by amateur archaeologists and by treasure hunters. But some have survived. And the most impressive of these were those that were the foundations of Cahokia, which was a very large city in its own right, in modern-day Illinois, right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri. We don't know for sure how many people lived there, but probably around 1,000 years ago, there may have been between 25 and 40,000 people living there at a time when no European city had more than maybe 15,000 or so. This would have been larger than London or Paris. And unlike most North American Indians, the people of Cahokia even worked with metal. Most American Indians never did much metalworking, although even those that did, such as those at Cahokia, really only worked with soft metals. They worked principally with copper for decorative purposes. They did not really make iron tools, for example. But Cahokia went into decline in the 1200s for reasons that are not entirely clear. It was abandoned by the early 1400s. It may be that they simply could not support such a large population. It may be that overhunting or deforestation wiped out at least some of the animals, some of the other resources in the surrounding area that they depended on. Indeed, the Mississippian culture as a whole declined in the 1400s and 1500s, in part due to contact with European diseases in the 1500s, mostly indirectly, as the trading networks of the Mississippians brought diseases from near the coast deep into the interior of eastern North America. But some aspects of their culture presumably remained in the culture of the groups we call the Eastern Woodland Indians. Many of whom were the descendants, we believe, of the Mississippians, although some, such as the Cherokee, moved into the areas that were depopulated as the Mississippians declined. Indeed, as Mississippian culture was declining, 5 tribes, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, and later a 6th tribe as well, the Tuscarora, united as what was known as the Iroquois League, or the 5 Nations. According to legend, this confederation, in which each tribe largely governed its own affairs, but in which they could all work together when dealing with outsiders, was founded by two leaders known as Decanawida and Hiawatha. And as I mentioned, eventually a sixth nation, the Tuscarora, joined them in the 1700s, having been chased out of North Carolina in the Tuscarora War. And the balance that these five and later six nations created, balancing local control with a unified way of working with outsiders, was so impressive that Benjamin Franklin considered it a good basis for the U.S. Constitution. The Six Nations practiced Three Sisters agriculture and used their power to attack their neighbors, the Algonquian peoples. And when Europeans arrived in North America, the Iroquois were a very important trading partner and an ally, or sometimes an enemy, in business and in warfare, treated very nearly as an equal by the Dutch, the English, and the French in North America, at least until after the American Revolution. In addition to the 5 or 6 nations of the Iroquois League, there were related groups known as the Iroquoian people, which also include the Lenni Lenape, sometimes called the Delaware, the Cherokee, who moved south from their more northerly home. And among the Iroquoian people, men tended to handle warfare and hunting and fishing, while farming was left in the hands of women, which also meant that most property, houses, farmland, tools, were under the control of Iroquoian women. And family ties tended to be based on the mother's family. When a couple got married, the man went to live in his wife's household. Boys were often raised as much by their maternal uncles as they were by their father. And when Europeans arrived, all this totally freaked them out. The economic, sometimes political power, the cultural power held by women seemed unnatural, as did the fact that from Europeans' point of view, all Indian men did was have fun. They went hunting, they went fishing, and they went to war, all of which were viewed in Europe as largely sports for the idle upper class. And so Europeans saw the Indians as lazy, and because the men did not own the land, it was sort of viewed that Indians as a whole did not own the land, and there was no reason not to settle it with people who would use it the way Europeans felt it should be used. And many other North American Indian nations had similar cultures, but without a major cultural center like Grand Chaco in the Southwest, or Cahokia along the Mississippi River, or the Iroquois Grand Council. Again, corn, beans, and squash, and for some people, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, but in all coastal regions, fishing was very important too. But for most groups, they were largely subsistence cultures, producing enough for their own use and some limited trade, some more limited than others. And while Europeans may have seen them all as Indians, each group had their own religious, artistic, and cultural traditions. And speaking of the Indians of the Pacific Northwest, they were particularly famous for their wood carving. Totem poles, for example, were found in what's now the northwestern U.S., the west coast of Canada, and were very important in the culture of many of the Indians living there. A number of groups living in the Pacific Northwest were known for celebrating major occasions with feasts, which are known as potlatches, in which a noble member of society would show off his wealth by giving gifts, giving away food, sometimes giving away slaves, giving away tools or jewelry, giving away titles and rights, hunting rights and fishing rights, to his various friends and followers. And the more could be given away, the greater wealth and prestige that indicated for the giver. Indeed, being able to spare so much, to have such a surplus you could give it away, went so far in some cases as leading some Northwestern Indians to destroy things in these potlatches, which which again totally freaked out Europeans when they encountered it. They saw it as wasteful and unnatural to give away or destroy hard-earned possessions. And to many outsiders, they seemed to live a pretty poor life, despite being in an area rich in natural resources. In the late 1800s, both the United States and Canada attempted to ban potlatches for the Indians' own good. Now, in many coastal areas, shells were used as currency and as trade goods and for other purposes as well. Probably the most famous of these were the wampum beads, used in what's now the northeastern U.S. primarily. These were shell beads made from the quahog shell and from whelk shells. And these could be used, as currency, and also often woven into necklaces and belts, sometimes in patterns, which themselves commemorated treaties or other agreements. When Europeans arrived, they eventually began producing wampum in massive quantities with metal drills, essentially creating inflation in the wampum market. Along the Pacific Northwest, a type of shell called dentalium or dentalia were sometimes used as trade goods, and later, after contact with the Old World, cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, which were often used as trade goods in parts of Africa and Asia, came to the New World as well, in part through the slave trade with Africa. Now, while the Indian nations of most of North America did not create large empires, in Central and South America there were some exceptions, some much larger and, Europeans might say, more technologically advanced cultural groups. For example, what is now southern Mexico and most of Guatemala and Belize were dominated by the Maya. Again, were not a single empire or kingdom, but rather a network of city-states, which grew up between starting around 250 AD. And while they seem to have shared a religion, certainly were deeply involved in trade and also fought with one another, and even have a written language, although not much of it survives. And they were not a single unified empire, but were a pretty unified cultural group, which produced incredibly impressive cities and other works of technological expertise. But around 900 AD, for reasons that are not well understood, many of these independent city-states were abandoned. The people moved out of the cities, although they continued to live in the land around them, a city-state meaning not just the city, but also the area around it that it controls for farming and other resources. And we don't know for sure why the Maya did this. It is one of the great mysteries of history. It is widely speculated that it was caused by drought. So there's no longer enough water to support these large cities agriculturally. But it's possible it was due to warfare or maybe some other unknown cause. But not all the Maya cities were abandoned. Those in the south largely were, but quite a few in the northern Maya region continued to be occupied. And certainly there was warfare among the northern Maya, which eventually did lead to the city-states being unified into 2 or 3 kingdoms, which often fought with each other, really devastating the Maya. So that by the time the Spanish arrived, the Maya had badly weakened themselves, and their great kingdoms were destroyed. But the Maya culture remained. Many languages in southern Mexico and Guatemala are descended from the languages of the Maya. Certainly their culture survived well into the Spanish colonial period and beyond. And we do have a few examples of their written language, in making them one of the very few pre-Columbian Indian cultures to leave us an historical record. And like many Central American Indian nations, the Mayans practiced human sacrifice. And there is some of their writing, one of the Mayan codexes, as they're often referred to. And again, human sacrifice was known among the Maya, and to a much greater extent amongst the Aztec, who became the dominant empire in what is now central Mexico, or at least southern central Mexico, with their capital at what is now Mexico City. The great city of Tenochtitlan, much of it built on artificial islands floating in a lake. Their society was based on extensive agriculture, but also on conquest. Beginning around 1300, they began to spread out from the city-state around Tenochtitlan and to conquer much of the southern part of central Mexico, which they did, of course, for prestige, for access to land and taxation and resources, but in part, too, in large part, because their religion required frequent human sacrifices, indeed daily sacrifices to appease the sun god. Without his gift of blood, the sun might not rise again tomorrow. Likewise, the rain god preferred the tears of children that would bring the rain. And so frequent human sacrifice on an almost unbelievable scale, indeed such a scale that some historians believe the Spanish made it up, or at least exaggerated it, although a lot of evidence backs up pretty widespread human sacrifice amongst the Aztecs. Human sacrifice on such a scale has its drawbacks in that you're killing lots of people. And while it may cause the sun to rise tomorrow, and when you cut out their hearts, you can fry them up in cornmeal and eat them, you're eventually going to run low on potential participants. But by conquering other peoples around you in warfare, prisoners of war could be used as human sacrifices. Indeed, for Aztec warriors, the greatest glory was not in killing an enemy, but in capturing one. And while they certainly had what are sometimes called swords, although they're really more of a club with many sharpened pieces of obsidian sticking out of them, they also carried nets with the intention of capturing prisoners to be sacrificed on the next major holiday. As you might imagine, many of the nations who were ruled over within the Aztec Empire resented them. Indeed, when the Spanish arrived in the New World, they found quite a few groups within the Aztec Empire willing to assist them in fighting against the Aztec. Now, by the time Europeans arrived in South America, the major empire there were the Inca, based in the Andes Mountains in western South America. It was now Peru and parts of Bolivia and Chile and Ecuador. The Inca domesticated the llama and the alpaca. They built roads across their empire. And there's some llamas. They created impressive irrigation systems to support terraced farming with different levels of farmland carved out of the side of the mountains like stair steps. And they built a vast empire while for the most part peacefully assimilating the peoples around them. But of course they taxed them too, but not with money, which the Aztecs did not, or the Inca did not have, pardon me. Rather, they taxed through the mita system, in which villages were required to provide labor. A certain number of people from a given village would go and work for the imperial government each year, producing food or other stuff for the empire, or would work on local roads or other things needed for the empire, taxing labor rather than property. And while the Inca had no system of writing, they kept records on knotted strings called quipus, lots and lots of which survive, but which unfortunately we don't know how to decipher. For a long time it was believed these were basic accounting, keeping track of trade goods or perhaps taxation of some sort, making sure that laborers were producing all the crops the mita system required of them. Some historians have recently proposed that they may record far more detailed information, but for now we're not absolutely certain. But there are archaeologists and anthropologists working on that to this day. And while the Inca Empire came to an end, indeed did not last that long, only about a century, languages spoken by the Inca are still widely used throughout South America. And while, again, it was a short-lived empire, relatively speaking, it spread quickly, in part because of the religious beliefs of the Inca. It's true, they did offer some human sacrifices, but not on the scale of the Aztecs. But they did believe that when the emperor died, he didn't exactly die. His household was preserved, and all the land that he had come to rule during his lifetime would continue to support his wives, his children, their various households. So even after the emperor died, he continued to control the land he had conquered. And so for his sons or grandsons to have their own wealth, they would have to conquer more land, which gave them a real incentive to expand the empire. And as they did, expanding from a pretty small area to control, as you can see, a very large part of western South America by the early 1500s. And the empire was created in 1438, continually expanded until about 1529, when two sons of a recently deceased emperor began a civil war for control of the empire, which badly weakened their society, weakened their political system. So when the Spanish arrived in Peru in 1532, about 100 Spaniards were able to completely seize control of that divided Inca empire. Now, in other parts of South America, and in most of the Caribbean, Indian societies were very much Stone Age cultures. Most practiced fairly basic hunting and gathering, although here and there, in parts of Central and South America, there was some slash and burn agriculture. As people would go into an area in the forest near their village, cut everything down and burn it. That would clear the ground, the ashes would fertilize the soil, and then they could grow whatever they needed to in the land they had cleared. Such land did not stay fertile for very long, so after a few years, more land would be slashed and burnt, more crops would be grown, and the previous fields abandoned to the forests, where the trees would regrow, but perhaps a generation later be slashed and burnt again. And in some areas in the Caribbean, there were some Indians, such as the Caribs, who gave their name to the Caribbean Sea, who, according to the Spanish, practiced cannibalism. Indeed, the original term was not cannibal, but caribal, although there are those who claim the Spanish exaggerated or invented this practice as a justification for conquering this region. Thank you very much, and tomorrow we'll talk about the early European exploration and settlement of the New World.